What if I told you that there was once a group of elite warriors, raised as soldiers from childhood, whose loyalty and power were unmatched? And yet, these very warriors, known as the Janissaries, went from being one of the most fearsome military forces in the world to becoming a corrupt and dangerous political faction that nearly destroyed the empire they helped build. It sounds like a story of betrayal, power struggles, and pride, doesn't it? Well, it's real, and it's one of the most captivating and tragic tales in history. This is the story of the Janissaries, the rise, glory, and fall of the Ottoman Empire's elite warriors. Part 1. The origins. Who were the Janissaries? Let's go back to the late 1300s, when the Ottoman Empire was in its infancy. The Ottomans were rapidly expanding their territory, and they needed soldiers who were loyal to the empire, not to local leaders or tribal nobles. This was a huge challenge. If the soldiers weren't loyal to the Sultan, they could easily be swayed to fight for someone else, someone more local, someone they were connected to. Sultan Murad, I saw that the key to creating a strong, centralized military power lay in building an army that answered only to him. And so, he devised a solution that was both brilliant and harsh. He created the devshirme, a system in which Christian boys, usually between the ages of 8 and 18, were taken from their homes in the conquered land of the Balkans, trained in the arts of war, and converted to Islam. The boys were then placed into two categories. The best of them would become the Janissaries, the elite soldiers of the empire. These boys were not just soldiers. They were raised to be the Sultan's personal guard, devoted to him alone. They were stripped of their previous identities. Their loyalty belonged to the Sultan and the Sultan alone. The system was cruel but effective. In the eyes of the sultans, this ensured that no local leader could sway these soldiers, and no bond of family or tribe could get in the way of their loyalty to the Sultan. But the story of the Janissaries was not just one of forced recruitment. It was also a path to power for many boys who came from poor Christian families. The Janissaries were often well-fed, given proper education, and provided with a chance to rise in status, much higher than they ever could have in their previous lives. It was a chance to escape poverty and climb the ranks of society. For many, it was the opportunity of a lifetime. Part 2. The rise, training, and life of a Janissary. Once these boys entered the devshirme system, their training began. The life of a Janissary was hard, disciplined, and relentless. Janissaries were expected to follow orders without question. They lived in special barracks, apart from regular soldiers and civilians, and their lives were highly regulated by the state. They underwent rigorous physical training, learning everything from hand-to-hand combat to advanced weaponry and military strategy. They became expert swordsmen, archers, and, eventually, gunners, as the Ottoman Empire was one of the first to use gunpowder-based weapons in warfare. But training didn't stop with weapons. Janissaries were also taught Ottoman law, Turkish language, and Islamic teachings. They were expected to be not just warriors, but well-rounded men, educated and capable of serving in government roles if needed. These boys were cut off from their families, isolated from the outside world, and subjected to a strict regimen of military discipline. They weren't allowed to marry. They couldn't own property. They didn't have personal lives. Everything they did was for the state. They were the Sultan's servants in the truest sense. This intense training created one of the most disciplined and loyal fighting forces in the world. Janissaries became highly respected in the empire. They had special privileges, including access to food, clothing, and protection that common people didn't enjoy. But it wasn't just their training that set them apart. It was the sheer loyalty they developed to the Sultan. Since they had no family ties, the Sultan became their father, and their devotion to him was absolute. By the 1400s and 1500s, the Janissaries were firmly established as the backbone of the Ottoman military. They weren't just soldiers, they were elite. They could rise to positions of power within the empire. They could become governors of provinces, advisors to the Sultan, or even high-ranking officials in the palace. In this way, they became an important part of the political system, both as military force and as political influence. Over time, Janissaries could go from being a poor Christian child to a powerful member of the Ottoman elite. Part 3. The glory, power, and success on the battlefield. By the time the 15th century rolled around, the Janissaries were at the peak of their power. Under Sultan Mehmed II, The Janissaries helped bring about one of the most important victories in world history, the fall of Constantinople in 1453. The city had withstood countless attacks for centuries, but with the Janissaries at the front, the Ottomans used massive cannons to breach the once impenetrable walls. After 53 days of siege, Constantinople finally fell, marking the end of the Byzantine Empire and the beginning of Ottoman dominance. For centuries, the Byzantine Empire had been a stronghold in Europe and Asia, but when the Janissaries stormed the walls of Constantinople, it fell, and the Ottoman Empire now controlled one of the most important cities in the world. Istanbul became the new capital of the empire, and the Ottomans were unstoppable. The Janissaries continued to fight for the Sultan. They helped expand the empire across 3 continents, Europe, Africa, and Asia. They fought in countless battles, including the Battle of Mohacs in 1526, where they destroyed the Hungarian army, solidifying Ottoman control over much of Central Europe. The Janissaries didn't just win wars. They created the myth of the perfect soldier. They were feared by their enemies, respected by their allies, and admired by all who knew their courage and discipline. The Ottoman Empire was at its peak, and the Janissaries were the heart of it. Part 4. The Privileges, from Soldiers to Influencers. As the centuries passed, something began to change in the Janissaries. They became more than just soldiers. They became influencers in the empire, and this was where things started to go wrong. In the early days, Janissaries were disciplined soldiers who followed orders. But as the empire grew, so did their power. They began to demand more rights. They started to rebel against the sultans who didn't treat them the way they thought they deserved. They started to marry, have families, and accumulate wealth, things that were previously forbidden. Some even became businessmen, running shops and controlling markets. The Janissaries were no longer the disciplined, loyal soldiers they once were. Instead, they became a political force, one that could control markets, influence royal appointments, and even remove sultans who didn't please them. Their power grew to the point where they could decide who would become the next sultan. In some cases, they even deposed rulers they didn't like. This power began to breed corruption. Instead of focusing on war, many Janissaries focused on gaining wealth and status. They became involved in political intrigue, making deals and working behind the scenes to further their own interests. The empire's rulers began to worry. The Janissaries had become more interested in politics and power than military service. They had turned from elite warriors into a political mafia, and that was dangerous. Part 5. The Decline, Weakness, Corruption, and Rebellion. By the 17th and 18th centuries, the Ottoman Empire was beginning to show signs of strain. European powers had developed stronger armies, while the Ottomans lagged behind. The Janissaries, once the most feared force in the world, were now refusing to adopt new technologies and military tactics. They resisted reforms that would modernize the military, fearing they would lose their power and influence. The Janissaries started to resist the new forms of weaponry and training that were being introduced into the empire. They grew lazy, corrupt, and complacent. Instead of leading the Ottoman army to glory, they were now more interested in their own comfort. They became an obstacle to the very progress they had once fought for. In fact, many Janissaries didn't even want to fight anymore. They had become too comfortable with their new wealth and status. As a result, the once feared Janissaries were now ineffective on the battlefield. They were no longer the disciplined warriors they had once been. Part 6. The auspicious incident of 1826. By the early 1800s, the Ottoman Empire was in serious decline. The sultans were losing control, and new powers were rising in Europe. Sultan Mahmud II knew that in order to survive, the empire needed to modernize, especially its army. But there was one major problem: the Janissaries. Mahmud decided that he had to get rid of them. In 1826, Mahmud secretly created a new army, one that was modern, well-trained, and loyal to him. When the Janissaries revolted, as they had done so many times before, Mahmud was ready. He declared the Janissaries traitors to the empire. Mahmud ordered his new army and loyal troops to attack the Janissary barracks. What followed was a brutal, bloody purge. Thousands of Janissaries were killed. Others were arrested or exiled. The event became known as the auspicious incident. It marked the official end of the Janissaries, a group that served the empire for nearly 500 years. Part 7. The Janissaries' influence in society and politics. As the centuries passed, the Janissaries transformed from a simple military force into one of the most influential institutions in the Ottoman Empire. Initially, their role was strictly military. However, their growing power and wealth meant they could influence not just the battlefield, but also the political and economic spheres of the empire. One of the most significant shifts in the Janissaries' role came when they started to act as political actors in their own right. The Janissaries' power, which was initially derived from their military might and loyalty to the Sultan, began to evolve as they sought greater privileges and rewards for their service. The Janissaries as kingmakers. The Janissaries' political influence became clear when they started to exert control over the selection of sultans. During the 17th and 18th centuries, when the Ottoman Empire began to experience instability, the Janissaries often had the power to decide who would sit on the throne. In fact, the Janissaries had a history of intervening in the succession of the throne, sometimes even removing sultans who didn't meet their expectations. It wasn't uncommon for them to launch coups if a sultan tried to reform the army or threaten their power. For instance, in 1622, Sultan Osman II attempted to reform the Janissaries, leading to a rebellion by the core. They captured him, and eventually, he was murdered by the very men he tried to change. By the mid-17th century, the Janissaries had become a critical force in Ottoman politics. Their ability to choose and overthrow sultans made them a powerful faction that could often dictate the political direction of the empire. This political involvement wasn't always beneficial to the empire, as it frequently resulted in turmoil, as the Janissaries' interests were often more concerned with their own power and wealth than the stability of the empire. The rise of corruption within the Janissaries. As the Janissaries became more powerful and more integrated into the political structure of the empire, they began to lose the very qualities that had once made them a formidable fighting force. Their elite status led to corruption. The Janissaries, who were once expected to maintain a lifestyle of discipline, began to indulge in the privileges of power. They began to exploit their status for personal gain. This often meant that they would bribe their way into the core, bypassing the original recruitment system. This shift diluted the quality of the core, as many new recruits weren't necessarily the best candidates for military service, but rather the wealthiest or most influential families. The greed of the Janissaries didn't stop at money. The most powerful among them began to control trade routes and monopolize businesses. Many Janissaries operated businesses, including shops, marketplaces, and even transportation. They amassed great wealth, and this gave them the ability to influence the economy. At the same time, the Janissaries became increasingly resistant to reforms. The Ottoman Empire was trying to modernize, especially in the face of European powers like Britain, France, and Russia, who had been advancing rapidly in military technology. However, the Janissaries were deeply conservative. They rejected new military tactics, new weapons, and the introduction of modern armies that would make them obsolete. The more they resisted, the more they grew isolated from the rest of the empire, weakening the very structure they were supposed to protect. Their once feared reputation had been tarnished. They became synonymous with corruption and laziness. The Janissaries, who once fought bravely for the Sultan, were now more interested in keeping their privileges intact than serving the empire. The Janissary revolts. As the empire's decline accelerated, the Janissaries began to launch rebellions when their privileges were threatened. One of the most notable revolts occurred in 1807, when Sultan Mahmud II attempted to reform the army and reduce the Janissaries' power. This was seen as a direct challenge to the Janissaries, and they rebelled in protest. The Sultan, who had already been facing external pressures from Europe, was forced to deal with internal strife as well. The Janissaries, along with other factions within the Ottoman political system, fought to maintain their power, and the Ottoman military became divided between those loyal to the Sultan and those loyal to the Janissaries. This internal strife was one of the key factors in the weakening of the Ottoman military. The Janissaries' focus on maintaining their status and privileges rather than adapting to the changing times was one of the main reasons why the empire began to falter. In this period of revolt and unrest, the Janissaries lost a great deal of support they had previously enjoyed. The longer they resisted reforms and modernizations, the more they became a symbol of stagnation. Their inability to adapt to the modern world led to their eventual downfall. Part 8. The changing face of warfare, the Janissaries and firearms. In the early stages of the Ottoman Empire, the Janissaries were widely regarded as some of the best soldiers in the world. Their expertise with swords, bows, and other traditional weapons made them formidable opponents on the battlefield. However, by the 16th century, the world was changing. The rise of firearms and gunpowder technology transformed warfare, and the Janissaries had to adapt to these new tools of war. Initially, the Janissaries embraced firearms. They were among the first to use muskets in battle, and their innovative use of gunpowder helped them secure many victories. The Janissaries' firearm expertise made them a key force in several significant Ottoman victories, including the capture of Constantinople. They were skilled in using cannons and other artillery to break through city walls, changing the way sieges were conducted. However, as the centuries passed and European powers advanced their military technology, the Janissaries began to resist the change. They stuck to their traditional ways and refused to fully embrace the new methods of warfare. As a result, by the 17th century, the Ottoman military was outclassed by European armies that had embraced new innovations like rifles, grenades, and modern artillery. While the Janissaries were once on the cutting edge of military technology, their refusal to adapt to new methods ultimately rendered them obsolete. The very same weapons that once made them so successful became a reminder of their stagnation and inability to keep up with the times. Part 9. The Ottoman Empire's decline and the Janissaries' fall. As the 18th century drew to a close, the Ottoman Empire was in a state of decline. Europe was rapidly advancing in both military technology and industry, while the Ottomans were struggling to maintain their old ways. The Janissaries, once the backbone of the empire's military might, had become a symbol of everything that was wrong with the empire: corruption, stagnation, and resistance to change. Sultan Mahmud II understood that the Ottoman Empire could no longer survive without reform. The Janissaries were a major obstacle to modernization, and Mahmud recognized that in order to survive, he would have to eliminate them. In 1826, he took a bold step to destroy the Janissaries once and for all. Part 10. The Auspicious Incident, the End of the Janissaries. The Auspicious Incident of 1826 marked the final end of the Janissaries. Sultan Mahmud II had long been aware of the Janissaries' growing influence and their resistance to reform, so he secretly began building a new, more modern army. The new army was trained in European-style tactics, with updated weapons and a focus on discipline. When the Janissaries learned these plans, they revolted. They took to the streets, hoping to force the Sultan to abandon his plans. But Mahmud was prepared. He had been quietly organizing his loyal forces, and when the Janissaries rebelled, they were met with overwhelming force. Mahmud's troops stormed the Janissaries' barracks and crushed the revolt. Thousands of Janissaries were killed, while others were arrested and exiled. The Sultan had finally rid the empire of its most powerful and troublesome faction. This moment marked the end of an era. The Janissaries, once the most feared and revered warriors in the Ottoman Empire, were no more. Their legacy, one of loyalty, power, and eventual corruption, ended in bloodshed. The story of the Janissaries is not just a tale of an elite military force that rose from humble beginnings to shape the fate of an empire. It is a powerful reflection on the nature of loyalty, power, and inevitable decay that comes when institutions fail to adapt to the world around them. From their humble beginnings in the late 1300s, the Janissaries were forged as an army of discipline, loyalty, and skill. They were the backbone of the Ottoman Empire's military expansion, helping the empire conquer vast lands, from the bustling streets of Constantinople to the shores of North Africa. Their expertise in combat, discipline, and unity made them the most feared and respected warriors of their time. Their rise was a remarkable story of ambition and innovation. The devshirme system, which allowed the Ottomans to build an army loyal solely to the Sultan, was a masterstroke in military strategy. Instead of relying on regional forces or tribal allegiances, the Janissaries were created to serve only one master, the Sultan. In exchange for their service, they were given a chance to rise in status, wealth, and influence. For many Christian boys taken from the Balkans, becoming a Janissary was a key to escaping poverty and achieving prominence. But as with all great powers, success eventually sowed the seeds of their own destruction. The Janissaries, once the epitome of discipline and loyalty, grew complacent and corrupt. Over the centuries, they amassed wealth and influence, creating an empire within the empire. They became political players, influencing the Sultan's decisions, deposing rulers, and even controlling key aspects of the empire's economy. Their growing power in political matters was mirrored by their increasing resistance to change. By the time the 17th century arrived, the Janissaries were no longer the focused, disciplined fighting force they had once been. Instead, they were more concerned with maintaining their status and privileges than with upholding the empire's military might. They refused to adopt new technologies, particularly firearms and modern military tactics, that were critical to the survival of the Ottoman Empire as a world power. The empire, once the strongest force in the world, was starting to fall behind Europe in military innovation, and the Janissaries were one of the key reasons why. Perhaps the most tragic element of their decline was their inability to recognize the changing world around them. They were so focused on their traditions, so wrapped up in the glory of their past, that they failed to see the empire slipping into irrelevance. The same loyalty that made them invincible in battle, the loyalty that had built an empire, became their downfall when it turned inward against the very empire they had sworn to serve. And yet, the Janissaries were not just warriors. They were a symbol of the empire's contradictions. They were loyal to a fault, but that very loyalty turned toxic. They were raised to serve the Sultan, but eventually they became the puppet masters, pulling the strings of power. They were supposed to be soldiers without personal desires, but greed and corruption led them to prioritize their own interests above the empire's survival. Their story is a cautionary tale about the dangers of complacency, corruption, and the unchecked growth of power. When Sultan Mahmud II finally decided to disband the Janissaries in 1826, he was not only removing a military force, but also tearing apart the very fabric of an institution that had stood at the heart of the Ottoman Empire for over 500 years. The auspicious incident, as it was known, marked the end of the Janissaries' reign. It was a violent, bloody purge, but it was also a necessary step for the survival of the empire. Mahmud had realized that in order to move forward, the Ottoman Empire had to modernize, and the Janissaries were the symbol of everything that was holding it back. The end of the Janissaries was not just the end of an era for the Ottoman Empire. It was the end of a way of life that had shaped the empire's military and political landscape for centuries. The fall of the Janissaries symbolized the collapse of an empire that had once been the dominant power in Europe, Asia, and Africa. But despite their tragic fall, the Janissaries left behind a lasting legacy. Their story is not just one of war and conquest, but also one of cultural influence. They helped shape the identity of the Ottoman Empire, and their presence can still be felt in Ottoman culture, from architecture to literature to military traditions. Their uniforms, with their tall, white felt hats, became iconic symbols of Ottoman power and authority. The Janissaries also played a role in shaping Ottoman music, particularly military music, which continues to be celebrated today. Their story also carries timeless lessons. The rise and fall of the Janissaries teaches us that power is fleeting and that loyalty must be tempered with adaptability. It reminds us that when we become too attached to our past glory, we risk losing sight of the future. The Janissaries' failure to evolve with a changing world was ultimately their undoing. So, what can we take from their story? The Janissaries remind us that no institution is invincible, no matter how great it may seem at its peak. Success in the past does not guarantee success in the future, and even the most disciplined forces can lose their way if they become complacent or greedy. In a broader sense, the Janissary story also holds a mirror up to modern-day institutions, be they in government, business, or even military organizations. We see how unchecked power, resistance to change, and a focus on preserving the status quo can lead to stagnation and eventual collapse. Their story is a timeless reminder of the importance of adaptability, accountability, and, most importantly, the ability to reflect on one's weaknesses before they lead to irreversible consequences. The Janissaries were once the pride of the Ottoman Empire, but in the end, they became a cautionary tale of how pride and power can blind us to the need for growth. In this way, their legacy lives on, not just in the history books, but in the lessons they impart to us today.